Welcome to Localism, the podcast where we ask if we're putting our power in the right places. I'm your Halloween candy addict and host, Blunchley. In today's episode, the biases, beliefs, and experiences that led me to think about a group of theories and ideas that I call localism. Okay, a couple things at the top here. Unlike every other episode in this series, this one is going to be almost completely about me. And that's for two reasons. First, because I think it's important to show the personal path I took to arrive at these concepts surrounding localism, and why my life experiences might have driven me in that direction. Second, because talking about my background at the front will help show my particular biases. And since I'm going to be talking about all kinds of stuff over this series, it seems only fair to be transparent about the ways that I'm an unreliable speaker or might not be able to be completely objective about some things. I'm calling this one Episode 0. And because it's so different, you can, if you want, just choose to totally skip this episode and go straight to Episode 1, which is going to be talking about the scope of local authority in America and how that works under American law. With all that out of the way, let's jump into it. Like a lot of people, waking up on November 6th to find that Trump had been elected was a huge shock. And it was a shock for me for a couple of reasons. First, because I hadn't thought he would win, and I hadn't voted for him. But also, him winning forced me to confront some contradictions in my own political beliefs that I think I hadn't really needed to tackle before. I'd spent a lot of the Biden administration profoundly disappointed. I looked around and I saw a lot of problems I wanted my government to address. Everyday items are growing more and more expensive due to inflation and simple greed. Housing, both rental and ownership, was incredibly unaffordable. Friends and neighbors didn't have health care. America's industrial base was being eroded further and further by offshoring. Wages weren't keeping up with price increases. Young people didn't have a path to stability and prosperity that didn't involve taking on huge loans to attend college. We were spending billions in bombs and death overseas instead of investing in our citizens. Rich elites were just getting richer and richer as the rest of America struggled. The seas were rising. Hurricanes were pummeling the South, and when those communities struggled, help was slow to arrive. I wanted the federal government to act. I wanted it to take big, dramatic, sweeping action, guarantee health care for citizens, build affordable housing, stop our policy of military interventionism overseas, bring more green energy online, revitalize our industrial base, level the playing field between workers and bosses, help disaster-struck communities recover, make homeownership more accessible, create good jobs that didn't need a degree, and improve the nation's infrastructure. Accomplishing all of that would require the federal government to expand its authority, to pull on all the levers of power at its disposal, and create new levers to pull. And I wanted them to do that. I wanted to see those new levers in place, and more dramatic action being taken. But then 11/6 happened, and I needed to think about what would happen when someone else was sitting in front of those levers, including the new ones. In order for Biden or FDR or Reagan or any other president to take action, that president has to expand the scope of executive responsibilities. The federal government is forever bursting at the seams as it swallows more and more power. Sometimes that's in the direction of good, or at least things that I thought were good. Sometimes that's in the direction of bad, or at least things that I think are bad. But in both cases, the tool that each side is using to reach its intended outcome is the same. Get bigger. Take more power. And then when the pendulum swings back, like it did on 11/6, and those in power are those that I think want to do harm, they're enabled by the very expansion that I cheered on when it was my side sitting in the White House or in Congress. How could I resolve this contradiction between more governmental action? I fucked it up. Accomplishing all of that would require the federal government to expand its authority, to pull on all of the levers of power at its disposal, and create new levers to pull. But then what happens when somebody else is sitting in front of those levers, including the new ones I had just pushed my side to create? In order for Biden or FDR or Trump or Reagan or any other president to take action, that president has to expand the scope of the federal government's responsibilities. The federal government is forever bursting at the seams as it swallows more and more power. Sometimes that's in the direction of good, or things that I think are good. Sometimes that's in the direction of bad, or things that I don't think are good. But in both cases, the tool to reach the intended outcome is the same: get bigger. And then when the pendulum swings back, just like it did on 11/6, and those in power are those who want to do harm, they are enabled by the very expansion that I cheered on when it was my people in Congress and the White House trying to achieve the goals that I wanted to see them achieve. How could I resolve this contradiction between wanting more governmental action, broader authority to address society's problems, but then being repulsed at seeing that same expanded authority used to enable federal actions I hated? And I couldn't avoid this contradiction just by saying, well, I'll just make sure my guy always wins, because your guy doesn't always win. And even when he does, the steps he takes to do the things you want him to do will just enable the guy you don't want to win when he gets elected. Because every expansion of power ultimately ends up being turned against you. I felt this conflict strongly because I was literally living it, in a sense. This probably isn't that big of a surprise based on what I've said so far and my reedy-ass Poindexter voice, but I put the coastal in coastal elite. I'm a left-leaning person working for one of the alphabet soup government agencies. That job is why I'm going by Bloomsley rather than my real name. I got my job during the Biden admin and walked in starry-eyed, ready to save the world. Our agency acted aggressively within our field, pushing the limits of what we were allowed to do and departing from past practices. And it felt like we really made some change, made a serious difference in the lives of the constituents we were serving. Then the admin switched, and I saw all that same aggressiveness and willingness to push boundaries be put to use by the forces of regression. It was embittering. What was the point of it all? Why had we been so bold and so willing to ignore convention and limits if at the end it just enabled the other side to come in and do bad stuff more forcefully? So while I was struggling with this contradiction in my own beliefs, I kept coming back to this other problem I'd been turning over in my head. Another issue of authority and how to make positive, lasting change. It was a problem I've been thinking about since my childhood. I grew up in California. You might think that's why I'm a know-it-all lefty, but no, quite the opposite. I lived in a rural area of Northern California. And there are a few places more conservative than certain pockets of Northern California. There are also a few places that hate liberals more. Part of that is the usual team game politics like anywhere else you can find. But only part. The other half stems out of a deep anger and sadness that's derived from a lack of agency. If you are a conservative in a blue state's rural area, your vote is useless twice over. On the federal level, there are a few cities in your state that will always speak on behalf of everyone in the state, and that will always render your vote for president or senator basically irrelevant. The same process plays out in miniature on the state level. You are simply outnumbered by the people who live in the cities. They always win out, and the laws that representatives pass always reach out to touch your community. This particularly hurts if, like where I grew up, you are a rural conservative that's located in a community that's 100 miles or more away from the city that is dictating your laws, which means that you're stuck obeying laws promoted by people who have never stepped foot in your community and know nothing about your day-to-day life. This creates this feeling that nothing that you really do at the ballot box or other areas politically really matters, that there's nothing you can do through the political process. And when you feel like there's just nothing you can do through the political process, that creates this sinking pit of powerlessness. And that powerlessness makes people express themselves through apathy, through anger at the distant parties that control your life, through mocking or hatred towards the people you see who are aligned with those distant parties that control your life. To the extent I paid much attention as a kid and a young adult, I did feel bad for my friends and neighbors and classmates, and understood why they would be frustrated by this dynamic. But to be honest, I didn't care that much, because the people who were in control, the people who were in those super distant cities and sitting in the state legislature, were people who shared my politics and my parents' politics. I would learn to appreciate this dynamic from the other end in just a few years. I went to grad school in a state that had the opposite political balance from California. There were maybe one or two smallish blue cities in a state that otherwise was deep red because of rural conservatives. Those rural conservatives controlled the state legislature and usually tilted the state red in federal matters too. The city my school was in, by coincidence when I started, had recently had a couple of big companies open offices or headquarters there. People with six-figure salaries came in and started buying up houses, usually with cash, or renting apartments at rates the landlords quickly raised. Wages outside those cushy white-collar jobs didn't keep up. The people who had worked as mechanics, grocery store clerks, cooks, garbage collectors, teachers, the people who had been born in the city and had lived there their whole lives, were suddenly left facing raised rents, raised property taxes, raised grocery store prices. The minimum wage in the state was $7.25 an hour. How is somebody making that supposed to keep up when her community gets flooded with people making six-figure salaries? Then, with the absolute worst timing possible, COVID hit. Those people making six figures, they got to work from home and keep making their money. I got to keep working on my degree from home while wearing PJs. Other people weren't that lucky. If you had to go in person to your job, because you didn't work in a comfy office or sit in a virtual classroom, then maybe your work got shut down because no customers were coming out from fear of COVID, or because the state said you had to shut it down. Maybe your job didn't close up, and you kept working because you had to make rent. And then you caught COVID and got sick enough to run out of leave, if you had any leave to begin with, and got fired. While in school, I was part of an organization that gave free assistance to people who were facing eviction. Most of our clients were parents who were struggling to balance taking care of their kids with trying to make rent. Before the pandemic, here are some common stories I heard for why someone was facing eviction. Maybe they lost their job because they got hurt or sick and ran out of leave and got fired. Maybe they couldn't find cheap enough childcare to take care of their kids while they were at work, so they ended up having to stay home to look after the kids and then couldn't also work enough hours to make rent. Maybe the landlord kept raising rent because more and more people with more and more money kept coming into the community and your wages just couldn't keep up. Maybe you ended up in the hospital due to an accident or an illness, and then you had to balance paying medical bills with keeping up on rent. This was before the pandemic. After the pandemic, everything just got even worse. This taught me two things. First, that a lot of us are just one accident or bit of bad luck away from losing our homes. Second, that my city needed more affordable housing, and it needed it yesterday. Helping stop evictions was good, but it would be a lot better if rents were sustainable enough to keep people from facing eviction in the first place. So between my classes, I got involved with some local political stuff, aimed at improving the city's housing situation. There were all kinds of ideas floating around, but two of the most common were, one, have the city itself fund and build more affordable housing, and two, make developers who were putting in all these luxury condos that were aimed at the people who were suddenly working at these corporate headquarters, set aside some units that were required to be affordable. There was also some more dramatic ideas getting kicked around, like rent control or raising the minimum wage in the city. I started playing a bit part, and I mean really a bit part. I think I was like stuffing envelopes with printed letters and maybe going to a few meetings, in this political group that was exploring those ideas, including the dramatic idea of rent control. I was optimistic. I didn't always agree with everything that was getting floated as a solution, but at least we were trying to do something locally about the big problems in our city. I guess I just kind of figured that this is what cities and city governments are for, looking at the problems that a community has. I was wrong. It turned out that we couldn't even do most of the more minor things we were considering. The city didn't have the legal authority. If we, for example, wanted to ask these big corporate developers to set aside units as affordable, we couldn't do that locally. The whole state legislature would have to pass a law. I'll talk more about how the whole state versus local thing works in a later episode, but for now, it's enough to know that the city basically couldn't do anything on its own without the state legislature giving it the go-ahead. Remember, this city is a little blue dot in an otherwise red state. The onset of these huge companies opening up headquarters in the city, and just the fact that we were a city rather than a rural town, made us different than the rest of the state. So these are problems that were uniquely felt in the city community, and the factors causing them were different than pretty much anywhere else in the state. That didn't matter. If we wanted to do something in our own backyard, we had to get the state legislators from all over the rest of the state, most of whom either hadn't stepped foot in the city or actively hated it, to agree with our ideas, and to pass a law that would apply equally across the state instead of just in our community. Basically, we were in a very similar position that the people in the rural community I'd grown up in had been. The rest of the state didn't like or understand us or our problems. They controlled the state legislature, so they imposed an agenda on us that didn't meet our needs and didn't respond to our concerns. In the end, we weren't able to ask for more affordable housing when these huge developers were swooping in and making bank off the new six-figure office workers. We didn't have the ability to do rent control. Hell, it was even worse than that. We didn't have the ability to make the choice for ourselves about whether rent control was a good idea. And that was kind of the worst part. Maybe we would have gone that route, maybe we wouldn't have. But in a fair world, it would have been our choice, the community's choice to make. The city did end up passing this measure that let it increase property taxes slightly to help fund one or two new affordable housing projects. And that was nice. It probably has done some good, but it wasn't near enough. And the amount of housing that was set to get built wasn't close to addressing the need. The city left COVID much worse than it had entered it. People were losing their homes, being forced to move to other parts of the state. If we'd done more, had the option of acting more strongly, maybe we could have done something to help these people. But it just wasn't up to us. It was up to the people at the state level, and they just didn't care. Or at least didn't care as much about the people struggling as they did about their big corporate backers, who saw stuff like affordable housing and higher wages as a threat to their bottom lines. So I graduate, and I leave the city. I try not to think about the fact that I'm leaving the city worse than it was when I found it. And I try extra hard not to think about the fact that me waltzing in with deep pockets from student loans and taking up housing might have been part of the problem. Let's fast forward a few years. I graduate and move to a different city for work. It's a city with problems not dissimilar to the city I went to school in. Housing is expensive. Prices haven't come down after COVID. The city has a market and a community that largely caters to rich, successful white-collar workers while being hard for working-class people to live in. I'm still mad and frustrated with how the housing stuff in the last city I worked out. And I channel that feeling into getting more involved from the outset this time. I start going to city council meetings. I start writing letters to council members. I join advocacy groups. I go to city events that are about giving community feedback to local legislative stuff. My mind is still stuck on housing. Right when I'd moved into this new city, when I'd gotten my job, there was a huge debate about how housing in the community should be handled going forward. The sides were predictable. On the one end was this group of wealthy retirees, the ones who live in $1 or $2 million homes in fancy neighborhoods and are sitting on big pensions or 401ks or inheritances. Side note, I remember talking to one of these people after a meeting, and she suggested that if I wanted to afford to buy a house, I simply wait and inherit the money to do so from my parents. I just kind of assumed she was joking, and I made this joke back about, oh, sure, I'll give my mom a call and let her know. She was not. She then told me how she afforded her massive home because she'd inherited her father's money. On the other end from this people was a weird group split between working class people who were trying to keep afloat and not get displaced out of their city, and these well-meaning but economically comfortable progressive types who got involved from a combination of generally wanting to do right by our neighbors, relishing the chance to participate in politics as a team sport and fling some mud at the opposition, and getting to feel virtuous over advocating for the right thing. In case you can't tell, I was firmly in that progressive group, and I deserve all that criticism just as much as the rest of them. So there were all these meetings about zoning proposals and other stuff. It seemed crazy how mad everyone was over these really minor proposals. This is stuff like you can build 1 story higher in a neighborhood. But these mild proposals that everyone was mad over was what the city was limited to, because we couldn't do much on the local level without state approval. After one of these meetings, I get approached by this person who asks about a sign I'm holding. We start to chat. He's a serious dude, is listening to what I say very carefully, agrees with some of what I'm saying, but pushes back on some other stuff. He mentions he's running for city council. I'm impressed with what I see, so I say I'll vote for him. And then I do something else. I ask if he needs any volunteers. He acts kind of surprised, and he doesn't have like a business card or a pamphlet for me or anything. I find myself wondering, is this guy actually running? And if he is, does he have much of a chance of winning? But he does pull out a cell phone and he takes my number. Weeks go by, and to be honest, I totally forget about this interaction. Then like 2 months later, I get a text from a number I don't recognize. It's the candidate's campaign manager. The manager asks if I'm still interested in helping, and if I am, if I'd like to canvass or go door to door asking people to vote for the candidate. Dude, I can't emphasize enough how much I did not want to do this. I am the least charismatic person imaginable. I'm not good with strangers. I'm not good at pitching ideas. Spending time knocking on people's doors to bother them about political stuff on their day off when they really don't want to be seeing anyone is about the last thing I want to do. It's a personal hell. But I agree anyway. I spent several months of weekends trudging around different parts of the city trying to get people on board with the candidate. And I'm right, it's miserable. Thankfully, most people don't open up when I knock. I wouldn't either if I was them. And the few who do are unfailingly polite, even when they say, no, I don't want to vote for your candidate. That doesn't really stop me from being an awkward piece of shit and fumbling when I'm trying to talk to someone. But you know what? I visit a lot of doors, and some people do listen. Some people talk to me and say that they're upset with schools or housing or the economy and that they hope my candidate can help them. This is a shoestring deal, by the way. This isn't like a federal campaign where money's pouring in. There's this big team of professionals at the top directing a bunch of volunteers. The team, quote unquote, is usually just me, the candidate, and the campaign manager. I'd be surprised if a guy ever raised more than a couple $1,000 for the whole affair. And almost all of it probably went to yard signs or newspaper advertisements. Anyway, we get to the party primary, which in my city is usually more important than the actual election because the city is solidly Dem. And for better or worse, most people are party line voters. The way the primary works is that the 6 candidates with the most votes get to be the party candidates. And everyone who votes in the primary gets to vote for 6 people. My guy ended up getting the 4th most votes and getting on the ticket. He got more votes than some incumbents. Turnout was super low, like 16% of all registered voters in the city. Those doors I knocked on, the awkward conversations I had, the literature I stuck into door cracks, I think it made an actual difference. I didn't get the guy elected, no question of that. But I was a part of what got him elected. I could point to my work and see that it had really made a difference. And that was just such a crazy feeling. After so many federal elections where I felt like my vote was just irrelevant, after so much time watching fucked up shit happen in the country or my community and feeling helpless to do anything about it, it was so empowering to take action and have that action actually matter. It tasted like agency. That isn't something any of us have gotten to taste in a long time. And it didn't just feel empowering for me. That was the thing. Anyone could have done what I did, as long as they were willing to walk around for a couple hours on a weekend. Most people could probably have done a better job. If you're listening to this right now, you can go out and make a difference in your local government with your own hands. You don't have to be a lobbyist or a billionaire or some fancy politics expert. You just have to show up. And this one little moment of feeling empowered, this realization that local government is something that the average person can have a hand in shaping, got all mixed up with my frustrations at the back and forth pendulum of federal action and the way that local governments had their hands tied by federal and state governments. And it brought all these questions swimming in my mind. Why is it that the form of government that's the most accessible to us, the closest to its constituents, the closest to our unique communities and our unique problems, is one that has the least amount of power to address them? What if we were to change that? What if our local governments, our communities, are at the top of our political system? Not a distant federal government that doesn't give a shit about you unless you're voters in like 5 states, and even then they only care about you once every 4 years or so. This federal government that moves slowly because it has to fight over every little culture war detail, has to try and play politics on a national level when you're just trying to get things done in your own backyard. Not the state government, which is all the same shit dynamics of the federal government but in a smaller package. Our local governments, the city council, the county board of commissioners. Why should they be the ones that have the least amount of authority under law? And what would America look like if we were to change that? What if we made local governments paramount? They were the ones that had the most power, and the state governments and the federal governments were the ones that had to defer. How would a system like that function? How would we need to change our institutions, our culture, our behaviors to make that system a reality? And what would be that system's problems, flaws, weaknesses, and contradictions? Particularly now, after the 2024 election, I've been trying to answer these questions. And I need to talk these ideas out to give them substance and structure, or I'm just going to go crazy. Maybe nobody's ever going to listen to this, and I'll be spending my time talking into the internet's empty void. But even if that's the case, even if no one ever hears or cares about this except me, at least I've tried to set out something different, an alternative, a different way to approach our country and our problems. At least I'll try to create a positive solution rather than just sitting helplessly in this frustration as things just get worse and worse. And besides, if anything is going to fix our country's problems, it's definitely a middle-class white guy starting a podcast where he complains about politics, because nobody has ever done that before, and since I'm the first one, I'm very confident that it's going to work out. Next time, if you want to rearrange the hierarchy of power, you first have to understand how that hierarchy functions. So I'll be diving into some of the nitty-gritty of how exactly local authority works in America, and why it's so constrained in so many ways. If that sounds interesting, think about following the show on Spotify, or shoot me a question at localistpod@gmail.com. That's localistpod@gmail.com. A huge thank you to Kevin MacLeod for letting me use the 2 songs in this podcast, Acid Jazz and Opportunity Walks. You can find these and a bunch of other really great songs on Kevin's website, incompetech.com. And the use of Kevin's music here is licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0.